Coming to you from Orange County, California, this is the Jug Life Podcast with Max Ada and Chad Wesley Smith.
Hey everybody, Chad Wesley Smith here, bringing you another episode of the Jug Life Podcast. I'm joined, as always, my co-host extraordinaire, magisterial Max Montana. And yes, I do use a website for adjectives that start with M. And magisterial, while it could be like the king's assistant, it also, what was it that you were like a regal and classy, which is obviously a total lie.
Yeah.
But magisterial Max Montana, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you guys doing?
We are here at Arlington Strength in Arlington, Texas, with this fine group of people. Today's episode is brought to you by Lone Stars and Deadlift Bars. It's a lifestyle. We're going to be we just went through a squat clinic with everyone here, working on technique, and now we're going to talk a little bit about exercise selection for the squat and different phases and different considerations to make. Then we'll be taking some questions, so let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So who is familiar, by a show of hands, through our YouTube, books, all that stuff, with the concept of phase potentiation? All right, so phase potentiation is a fancy way for me to sound smarter than I am by saying using one part of training to improve the potential of the next part of training. And this has to happen in a logical, strategic sequence. And the way that we do that is hypertrophy training, so training to build bigger muscles. We take those bigger muscles into a strength phase, and teach those bigger muscles how to produce more force. Then we take those bigger, more force-producing muscles into a peaking phase and hone the neural qualities of the one rep max and the technical execution of 1 rep max, straight bar, 2 depth squat in whatever your competition equipment is, pause bench press, deadlift from the floor, no straps, all that stuff. How you do it in the meet. So through those phases, there's some considerations to make about how you choose your exercises that are better suited for each part. So during hypertrophy, what we're trying to do is add volume, and we're trying to overload your volume, generally in the range of about 60 to 75% intensity for sets of 6 to 12 reps. And the more work you can do in that range, the more muscle you're going to be able to build. And the principle of overload, principle number 2, our second most important priority in the scientific principles of strength training, which read the book, watch the video series, a lot of info there, a lot more than I can talk about today. But principle of overload dictates that training must be challenging enough, stimulating enough to drive adaptation. So heavy enough to cause strength increases, voluminous enough to cause muscle gain, and that it must get harder over time. So in this hypertrophy phase, we're going to do more volume, more volume, more volume. And you can achieve that several different ways. You could do the same sets and reps with more weight. You could do more reps per set for the same number of sets and the same weight. You could do more sets at the same weight and the same reps, or a little bit of a combination of 2 or 3 of those. I prefer not to just add reps per set, as that's you could run into a problem of fatigue management where you're training too close to failure too soon, or you could get into training, sets of 15, 20 reps, which, while still very useful for muscle building, are maybe too general for powerlifting, are maybe too fatiguing, and might run into an issue of training more for muscular endurance than just for muscle size. So we want to stay in that 6 to 12 rep sweet spot for the most part. And there are exercises, for the squat particularly, that are better suited to training more volume, particularly when you consider, and I feel myself saying particularly a lot of times here.
He's just self-conscious about that.
All right used to be the one. There's a video where I say all right, because with a crowd like this, I'd say whatever thought I'm thinking is all right, and looking for like, yes, that is all right, or no, what the fuck are you talking about? There's a video, I said it 46 times in 15 minutes. Because I treat the camera like I'm talking to a person. I try and do it like that. So I was checking with the camera every time. All right? All right,
He thought the camera was Matthew McConaughey at the same time.
I'm convinced that Matthew McConaughey in that movie, he didn't even know that they were making a movie. That's just him, and he just kind of wandered onto the set. What y'all doing over here? What are all these cameras for? And all right, I digress. So there are exercises that are better suited for training with more volume. In the squat, and when you have to consider training the squat, bench, and deadlift together particularly. So who in powerlifting meets, or if they're taking a 1 rep max in training, is going to squat with a lower bar position? Most people will, all right? The low bar squat obviously involves more back than a high bar squat or a front squat. And if we're training really high volumes with the low bar squat, the back may be too fatigued to also train high volumes alongside that in the deadlift. And as you get into training 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the mythical 8 sets of 8, in the low bar squat, who has times where they train a bunch of low bar squats and their arms hurt like crazy after? I know, I've been there. So that's going to prevent your ability to also train high volume in the bench press. So the high bar squat, front squat, those are both going to be better options during hypertrophy, high volume training than the low bar squat. They're going to build muscle in the quads, the muscles most responsible for a big squat. They're not going to beat up your arms the same way. You're going to be able to train high volume. It's going to give you some variation, to break up the staleness of training, to avoid what we call adaptive resistance, which is basically just doing the same thing for too long. Avoid staleness, just avoid staleness in training. So during hypertrophy training, our preferences are to use the high bar squat, the front squat, belt squats, which is a belt hanging from your waist, no loading of the back, which is great, particularly if you fall into that strong back, weak legs group, which again, we have a whole video just about that. If you're in that group, and even if you're doing high bar squats or front squats, a quad dominant variation, but you hit the hole and your hips shoot back and you still good morning it up, you can do that with a high bar or front squat. Your back is just going to keep staying stronger than your legs that way. But the belt squat, there's no way for your back to act on the bar, so your legs have to do all the work. Exercises like leg press, hack squat. I think powerlifters and strongmen and everything demonize machine training for a long time. It's not functional or whatever. During hypertrophy, I think it is important to put more emphasis on the muscle over the movement. All right, high bar squats are not so different than low bar squats that if you don't do a low bar squat for a month or 2 months when you're 8-10 weeks out from a meet, you're not going to forget how to do them. All right, this is how different high bar and low bar squats are. About an inch or two of bar placement on your back. The technique is not necessarily very different beyond that. So you don't need to worry about forgetting how to do the technique, because they're similar enough, and the high bar squat's going to allow you to train the muscle more. Leg press, hack squats, and then unilateral type of training, walking lunges, step ups, split squats. Those are all going to be things that you can train really high volume with. In regards to how you should sort of proportion your training between those, if you do a bunch of sets of high bar squats, that's always going to help you build more muscle than doing a bunch of sets of lunges. All right, so we want to prioritize the big exercises first, and use this analogy. If you were to think of a bucket and you put a couple big rocks in the bucket, you get to the point where you can't add any more rocks, but the bucket is not full. So the bigger rocks are squat, bench, and deadlift, and they're close variations. All right, but the bucket's still not full. The bucket is your MRV, your maximum recoverable volume. So let's pour some gravel into that bucket now. The gravel, all right, is that next tier of exercises. Maybe leg press, hack squat, belt squat. You get to the point where you can't add any more gravel. The bucket's still not full, but you can't add any more gravel. Then we pour the sand into the bucket. That would be that next tier of exercises. Step ups, split squats, lunges, maybe even direct hamstring work like like GHRs or hamstring curls, maybe even leg extensions if that doesn't bother your knees. You know, people look at some of those like, oh, that's just a gym bro, like a stupid bodybuilder exercise. Well, bodybuilders have really fucking big muscles, so you know, you can do those exercises to make a bigger muscle and then use it, you know, functionally or specifically towards your sport in the later phases. So again, we're trying to overload volume, more volume from one week to the next. You can achieve that a lot of different ways. The way that we generally prefer to do it is small increases in both the weight on the bar and the number of sets that you do per week. You know, finding that sweet spot is some trial and error. Probably the most common periodization scheme that we'll use, and it's really, really effective for beginners, very effective for a lot of intermediate lifters, assuming that they can recover decently well, is very simple. Week 1, maybe an 8 rep max at a 7 to 8 RPE, like a conservative 8 rep max. And then we drop down 8 to 12% and do 3, let's call it right now, 3 back down sets, 3 sets of 8. The next week, 8 rep max at an 8 to a 9 RPE. So a moderate 8 rep max. Then we'll add 1 back down set. So now it's 4 sets of 8 back down sets. Week 3, 8 rep max at a 10 RPE. Absolute 8 rep max. That's the time to set a PR. Now 5 sets of 8 back down sets. Then take a deload. Then if you're going to go another hypertrophy block after that, you could start 8 rep max again, but start at 4 back down sets. So you go 3, 4, 5, deload, 4, 5, 6, deload, with those increasing 8 rep maxes from week to week. We have a video called Selecting and Progressing Weights. Very, very important skill, and I think as people become more advanced lifters, they get better and better at it, of strategically selecting weights from week to week, because people, they get ambitious and they want to set a PR in week 1. But you know what's going to happen then? You're going to accumulate too much fatigue too fast, and by the time you reach week 3 or week 4, you're actually doing a lighter weight because you're too beat up or you're too tired. So start low, give yourself room to build through the weeks into the deload. Moving on to the next phase, strength. This is where we're taking that bigger muscle that we built during hypertrophy, teaching it how to produce more force. So in the strength phase, we have to overload intensity. You have to put a heavier weight on the bar to get stronger and stronger. Well, now we're getting closer to competition, so specificity, what you do in a meet, is more important. So while we were prioritizing movement or muscle over movement in hypertrophy, now the movement is going to become more important. Not that you have to only do your competition technique, that would be for peaking, but it can now be a mix between high bar and low bar. Typically I would have someone do 100% high bar squatting or 100% not low bar squatting during hypertrophy, and then as we get into strength, it's maybe 50-50, 70-30 to low bar, depending on how their arms can tolerate, depending on how long the training cycle is. But now we're going to be putting more low bar squatting in and focusing on not necessarily doing more sets every week, but doing more weight for the heaviest set or a higher average weight through your top sets. There's so many different ways to organize this that are all effective. I can't lay them all out right now, but if we were to stay with that same theme that we're using of the increasing 8 rep maxes with increasing number of back down sets, when we reach the strength phase, we want to take the reps down more the 3 to 6 rep range. 75, maybe up to 90% intensity is going to be appropriate now. That's going to be the sweet spot for strength development. So now let's start out with a 5 rep max in week 1. We're going to do a 5 rep max, and you can do a lot of back down sets there. So maybe we drop 10 to 15% off of that and do 5 sets of 5 after. The next week, a heavier 5 rep max. We still started conservatively in week 1. So 7 or 8 RPE. Week 2, 8 to 9 RPE, moderate 5 rep max. Now with 4 back down sets. The weights are getting heavier, so you're not going to be able to do as many sets. That's fine, that's expected, that's all part of the plan. Week 3, 5 rep max at 10 RPE. Set a PR, 3 back down sets. Very simple, very effective strategy. that would move us on to the peaking part of the program. The peak is right before the meet. This is about developing technical prowess and the neural qualities of the 1 rep max. So you got to handle heavy weights, 90% plus. Maybe if you're a very advanced lifter, 85% plus, just because your weights are more fatiguing, so you could get away with a little bit lower percentage. Now the only thing that matters is the competition exercise. Any variation you do would be for maybe 1 or 2 extra sets, maybe some belt squats because you can't tolerate as much low bar squatting and your arms get beat up, but you still need stimulus in your legs. So now it's just about competition exercise. If you put knee wraps on, peaking, you definitely want to have them on. You probably want to have them on for your top sets, your heaviest work during strength as well, depending on how good you are in your wraps, how comfortable and accustomed to them you are. So again, the peaking, it's just about the competition exercise. But when you load the exercise so heavily, 90% plus, now that generates a lot of neural fatigue. All right, neural fatigue is the slowest to decay. So it's if you were squatting 2 or 3 times a week during hypertrophy or strength, all within those overloading parameters, the percentages and sets and reps that we talked about, it's going to be very difficult for you to continue doing that during peaking because the neural fatigue won't be decayed in time. But with the goal of technical prowess in mind, we can't just go to squat 1 time a week during peaking because that's not enough practice. So now you're going to have your peaking, your heavy overloading session, and maybe 1, 2, 3 extra technique sessions, which would be like 60 to 80% for singles and doubles. Not hard enough to generate more fatigue, but heavy enough so you can feel your technique. And what I suggest to people in those technique sessions is to find the lightest weight that you can feel your technique at. And the more advanced you become, generally the lower percentage that will be. Because if you squat 500 pounds and you put 135 on your back, you kind of just go up and down and you can't really tell, was I too far forward? Where's the weight in my foot? You can't feel it. But if you can feel that at 315, that's great. If it takes you to 405 to be able to feel that and get good quality technical work in, that's not quite as good because you won't be able to do as many sets and reps there without introducing more fatigue. Does that make sense? Last note I want to have about that is the concept of mechanical overload. All right, we talked about the principle of overload, training that's hard enough to drive adaptation and must become harder over time. Mechanical overload is the use of exercise variations for you to handle supramaximal loads, over 100%, more weight than you can lift on your own. The ones that I really like for the squat would either be the reverse band squat, so bands coming down from the top of the rack to assist you out of the hole, or a very simple exercise called a walkout and hold. Either way, when you're doing these, 5 to 25% overload, so 105 to 125% of your max is sufficient for this. The stronger you are, the lower on that scale you'll be. If you squat 600 pounds, doing a 25% overload, so putting 750, thank you, 750 on there, you're going to be shot for 2 weeks. Your nervous system's going to be destroyed, your back's going to hurt, knees going to hurt, everything's going to hurt. But if you squat 225 and you do it, and you only did a 10% overload, so you're putting 245, 250 on there, that's not really going to feel it's not going to feel like that big of a difference. So lighter weights you're lifting, higher percentage you can overload. We don't want to get into a 50% overload. It might look really cool to get the thickest bands from Rogue and hang them from the top of your rack, and you did 200% of your max, and everyone went on your Instagram and like, oh my God, bro, you're such a beast, that was so badass. And you put the video on YouTube and you don't say that it was reverse band, you just title it like 600 pound raw squat and your PR was only 300, and then people watch it and they're like, oh, what the fuck is this person doing? And when you're selecting those weights, remember that training doesn't happen in a vacuum. What you do today affects tomorrow, affects the next day, affects so on and so forth. So if you have this hugely stimulating, hugely fatiguing session, how do you feel after that? The next day, 2 days later, you feel like shit. You're tired, you're run down, weights feel heavy, and while you might have had a great squat workout because of it, if it makes you have a bad bench workout and a bad deadlift workout subsequent to it, that's probably not the best thing for your total, and that's what powerlifting is the biggest total. However, we combine 3 lifts to get there. All right, so I hopefully haven't confused you all too much. So let's go ahead and get to the Q&A. Anything I just talked about, anything we haven't talked about, anything we talked about today, or just anything you're wondering about.
So, given that structure you laid out, how would you lay out your training in a given week with bench and deadlift, given the same principle?
Yeah, so there's tons of potential ways to effectively lay out training. I'd say the most common way that I organize a week of training for people is we put our primary squat days on Monday and Friday, our primary bench days on Tuesday and Saturday, and our primary deadlift day on Wednesday. And then we'll typically add smaller sessions on top of that. The smaller someone is, both in height and weight, the less experienced, the less strong they are, they'll be able to do more and more frequent training. So almost everyone I train has at least another moderate deadlift, a smaller deadlift workout after those Friday squats. A lot of female lifters I coach on that day 4, Thursday, usually we'll have another bench workout. Some people could even go a small bench workout on Monday, a bigger one on Tuesday. Maybe we add a little bit of squat related work after Wednesday's deadlifts. But there's a nearly endless amount of ways to organize it. The principle of SRA video on YouTube will go more in depth on that. We're going to be recording soon a how to find your frequency video, taking all these individual differences into account. Height, weight, experience, gender, hormones, diet, sleep, strength, all these different things, and help you, find a better starting point of what to do with your frequency, and then you can make smaller micro adjustments off of that based on experience. Other questions?
So you talked about doing high bar as a way to kind of provide relief for your arms and your back. How do you feel about using various specialty bars like safety squat bar or double low, anything like that?
Those are all good variations, right? I mean, the Duffalo bar, the bow bar, does basically the same thing as a high bar squat. It kind of puts your elbow down a little bit lower, puts your hand lower. So to me, that's an interchangeable exercise, high bar or a Duffalo bar. It might have a small variation where the bar kind of moves a little, but it's so insignificant. Safety bar squats are also a great exercise that can take the place of high bar squats. That's a little bit different because it puts the weight a little bit forward of you. If you put your hands on the bar instead of on the handles, it'll bend your back over a little bit more, so it puts a little more stress on your upper back. Something to be aware of. But in general, I would say those exercises are essentially in the same family of exercises. They're not so far removed from a high bar squat that they don't fall into that same category. So good choices for hypertrophy phase, just like a high bar squat.
Yeah, if there was any drawbacks to them, because of the camber of the Duffalo bar, while the bar is sitting high up here,
right,
it's a little bit lower there, so it's like halfway between a high bar and low bar squat. It's a high bar position, but a low, more similar low weight position. Safety squat bar is kind of between front squat and a back squat. So you're not going to be likely. I'm really bad at the safety squat bar. I used to be good at it, but then I somehow became bad at it and would do high volume and make myself throw up behind the gym. But but you won't be able to use as much weight probably in the safety squat bar, so it's not quite as good at overload. But it's even less stress on the arms. So if your bench is lagging relative to your squat, safety squat bar can be a great option there and allow you to do an extra set or two of bench per week. Other questions?
So my deadlift's a lot stronger than my squat. Is there a way to address that besides, just tons of work? Is there a way to narrow that gap?
Yeah, definitely. So the question with the deadlift being much higher than the squat. So with that, we're identifying that you would be in the strong back, weak legs group relative to that. We have a whole video about this called assessing leg versus back strength and talk about solutions for it, but I'll talk about them here again. If you're in strong back, weak legs, you could do high bar squats, you could do front squats, quad dominant exercises, but you hit the hole, your hips shoot back and you're good morning them up. You can still do that even with the quad dominant exercise. So the only thing that we can do is eliminate the back from being able to move the weight. So belt squats do that because the weight's hanging from your hips. Leg press, hack squat, they do that. When you do high bar squats and front squat, be mindful to really push your knees forward, to force yourself to stay upright. If you go to weights that you can't do that, you can't maintain that position, then it's not going to get the effect that you're looking for in this situation. Split squats, lunges, step ups, those are all going to train the legs in absence of the back. So those are all good options. Other questions?
What would you do in the case of the reverse, where the squat is super strong?
Yeah, so if your legs are stronger than your back, now we need to do more direct back training. Conventional deadlift is going to be the most effective thing for that. Obviously, that's very fatiguing, so you can get into other variations, RDLs, good mornings, back raises, strict reverse hypers, all those can be good. And from a technique standpoint, being very active, driving your upper back into the bar, so you're effectively using all the back strength that you do have.
Something to remember too about both problems, weak back, weak legs, you also have to try and counteract the fault in your technique when you train. So when you do squats, you need to find those effective ranges of weights that allow you to perfect the technique with as much weight or as much intensity as possible, that you're still able to, the intensity should be so much that you're focusing on doing it right, but not so light that if you don't focus, it's easy. Does it make sense? So it should be heavy enough that you have to try to do it correctly and train yourself to do it correctly, but if it's too light, you'll just do it, however you want. So in addition to fixing the weakness, you also have to perfect the execution of the lift. So don't forget that that's a part of it, right? All your warm-up sets, all of your work sets, those should be dialed in technically so that you're reinforcing the muscle that you're building, you're reinforcing the technique and the strength that you're gaining. Make sense?
To that effect, I'm sure a lot of you are squatting today and you're listening to what Max and I say and you're thinking about 10 different things as you go. And it feels kind of shitty as you're doing it, and it's slow. And so as you're thinking about cues during training, a sort of simple rule for that is weights less than 70%. You could think about 3 cues per set. All right, maybe something for the setup, something for the descent, something for the ascent. As you get into those 70 up to 85% weights, 2 cues per set. As you get into training at 85%, 90% plus 1 cue per set. When you go to a meet, no thinking. All right, you do a great job of thinking about the technique, being deliberate and focused in training. When you get to a meet, the technique you have is the technique you have. You're not going to make some adjustment, some big technique improvement when you get to a meet. And every little bit that you think, it's slowing you down.
Yep.
So we have to do a great job of thinking about your technique in training, not overthinking it, but thinking about it in training and purposefully working on it so that when you go to a meet, you can shut your brain off, because training is the time for thinking, competing is the time for doing. Other questions?
So you got a big bencher, and we already went over modalities like the bird dog and scaffold retraction. But as you start to peak more pain in your elbows and shoulders start to get beat up, should you change your benching or your splits for training to accommodate that more back squat?
So the question is, as your arms get beat up from the squat closer to a meet when you're doing more low bar, how can you adjust your bench to work around that? Simplest thing you can do, and the split that I gave of squatting on Monday and Friday, benching on Tuesday and Saturday, just flip those days is a simple thing. Bench the day before the squat, because a heavy bench isn't going to affect the squat day the same way that a heavy squat would affect the bench day. As you get closer and closer to competition, you don't have the luxury of adjusting volume up and down because you really feel beat up that day or something. You got to get the work done that you got to get done. So then we're going to get into using more, passive modalities like maybe Graston, active release. The whole time be proactive and preemptive in doing shoulder mobility, during hypertrophy and strength phases. So you've got great scapular control, and when you get set up for the squat, you're not having to kind of wedge yourself in the same way, but you can actually move properly into the position. But if you're having to finish a squat session and slap ice on your elbows right after, so be it. You don't want to become reliant on that and NSAIDs and stuff for months at a time. But if it's a couple weeks here and there, that's the life you've chosen, to lift very heavy weights. So
Mind over matter.
yeah.
If you don't mind, it doesn't matter.
So if somebody has equally balanced legs and back, what would be a normal ratio for their deadlift, maybe conventional deadlift to like regular squat? Because to me, from what we were talking about, if you have a big deadlift, it sounds like you have a stronger back. If you have a big squat, it sounds like you have stronger legs, and kind of knowing what the normal range might help guide hypertrophy.
So that's the simplest way to assess it. The question is, how do you know if you're balanced leg to back strength? Real simple way would just to put in like your Wilks points for the bench and the squat, and see them there. There's a lot of factors to consider besides just the number on the bar, because you could have someone with a great deadlift build whose deadlift is much higher than their squat because their arms are long and their waist is small, not because they necessarily have a very strong back compared to their legs. So extreme body types aside, and you could have someone with a super strong back and they can't put their, reach their hand into their own pocket. They're probably not going to have a very big deadlift. Yeah, they're not going to have a very big deadlift. As you become more advanced in size into the superest of weight classes, it's very rare to see big supers with deadlifts higher than their squat. My best squat in sleeves is 937, and my best deadlift is 815. Now, yes, my legs are stronger than my back, but if there was someone who weighed 165 and their squat was 100 plus pounds higher than their deadlift, that would be clearly indicative of, oh my God, does this person even have a back? I haven't really looked into like calculating that ratio at the different weight classes and stuff.
Yeah,
but
I mean, there's probably some data, but the reality is like it's not, for my money, it's not super important that you have a certain balance. The whole point of understanding weak legs versus weak back is so you can target the areas that you're going to have to work at right before you even start training. Like, we can look at somebody and assess them and say, oh, okay, this guy, I know the selection of exercises, where things need to go to develop the squat, right?
because you can tell a lot by watching the squat
Right.
happen, that generally the strong legs, weak back person, because both of them are going to miss the lift 2 to 5 inches above parallel, and that's sometimes just depending on how tall they are. But that strong legs, weak back group, which Max and I both fall into that. Max might be the most like that ever, in that he had front squatted 250 kilos and couldn't deadlift 250 kilos at the time, right?
Yeah.
But if you have someone, and we talk about this in the assessing leg versus back strength video, and show some different examples, who hits the hole and is very fast for the first few inches out of the hole, and then the lift comes to a very rapid stop. Like, they explode out of the hole, and 2-3 inches above, they hit the wall and it's over. They're not there grinding against the weight. They just hit the hole and they're going back down, and the spotters are grabbing the bar, hopefully. That is strong legs, weak back. Strong back, weak legs, they're maybe a little bit slower out of the hole, but as they get to that sticking point a few inches above parallel, are generally able to fight against the weight a lot longer because their back is strong in that position, and their back just kind of runs out of energy because it's not being used quite in the right sequence. But as you watch a squat happen, that's typically what it's going to look like. Strong legs, fast out of the hole, hits the sticking point, and the lift is over very quickly. Strong back, slower out of the hole, able to fight against it. If it's light enough, they can good morning their way through it, and if it's not, they can't.
What movements do you find most beneficial for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
What movements do I find most beneficial for Brazilian
know.
Jiu-Jitsu?
Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
So I've only been training Jiu-Jitsu myself since about September of last year, but I did have a lot of experience before that coaching Jiu-Jitsu, really high-level guys, Romulo Barral, Kyron Gracie, Victor Estima, Felipe Pena, back when Felipe Pena was a purple belt, like 19 years old, coming in, he won Purple Belt Worlds. He'd come from Brazil for like 6 weeks. Next year came for Worlds Camp, brown belt, won Brown Belt Worlds. Now he's the best in the world ADCC champ. As we look at the movements that are really important, it's kind of, think of it as movement categories of hip extension exercise, probably the most important. Upper body pulling exercise, the next most important. Squatting movement, the movement category of squat related exercise, third most, and upper body pressing, the fourth most important. What exercise you actually do within that category is going to have to do a lot with preparedness. In an ideal world, if I had to pick one exercise for each of those categories, conventional deadlift for our hip extension exercise, bent over rows as the back exercise, high bar squats for the squat exercise, and bench press, maybe a neutral grip bench press for the pressing exercise. But injury history, different stability issues, mobility issues are gonna change things all along the way for different people. So think about the movement category more so than a specific exercise. Beers with Chad 13 maybe. It's called CWS and BJJ. Listen to that one, and I talk about it more there.
When you were laying out the hypertrophy strength and peaking phases, is there a certain ratio you like to follow, or is it dependent on many factors, what factors you consider? And if you run multiple in a row, for example, on a hypertrophy, do you like to switch exercises after each like 4-week block, or do you like keep the same if they rest, or what factors you consider there as well?
Yeah. So the question is about proportion of the phases. How much hypertrophy, how much strength, how much peaking. The first thing that has to be considered in that is the competition calendar. It's going to change. It's going to change the answer of how many weeks of hypertrophy you should do if you're 12 weeks out than if you're 30 weeks out. So let's talk about it as maybe a percentage. You could train any of the phases, should be a minimum of 3 weeks. Strength and hypertrophy could go as long as 4 months. Peaking usually from 3 weeks maybe to 2 months. But in a proportion, beginners need the most hypertrophy. They're lacking muscle mass. So beginners want to take about 50% of their training towards hypertrophy. Then there'll be 35-ish% towards strength, and then a short 10-15% towards peaking. Intermediate lifters are going to put a greater attention towards their strength training. So there may be 30 to 40% hypertrophy, 50-ish% in strength, and the remaining in peaking. And advanced lifters, and there's a lot of different ways, what's beginner, what's intermediate, what's advanced. We can base that off of experience. We can base that off of how strong they are. If you watch Principle of Phase Potentiation video and Individual Differences video, I talk about that there. But from just experience, beginner less than 3 years, intermediate 3 to 6, advanced 6+, a lot more things to consider than just that. But the advanced lifter is going to be focused more on more on peaking, depending on how advanced they are. If they've maximized their weight class, if you're Dan Green and you're cutting 15 kilos of body weight to make 220s, it's probably not going to behoove you to do a long hypertrophy phase and add more muscle so you have even more to cut. It still might be useful to do a high volume training to build up work capacity, to fight off staleness and avoid adaptive resistance, but at that point it would be a misnomer. It would just be high volume training, not hypertrophy. So advanced lifter could be, let's say, from 0 to 20% in hypertrophy, from 20 to 50 to 60. If they did no hypertrophy, we could get into 50 or 60% of their training is strength, and then the rest is going to be peaking. As far as changing exercises as you go, the main exercise, if you're focused on high bar squatting in hypertrophy, even if you're going to do 4 hypertrophy phases in a row, that could be the main exercise throughout the whole time. You could change up the smaller exercises after it, and this all becomes a question of two concepts: directed adaptation versus adaptive resistance. Directed adaptation, if you want to get better at something, you got to do it. You got to do it with focus for an extended period of time. Adaptive resistance, the longer you do the same thing, the less effective it becomes. So finding that sweet spot between the two is sort of the art of coaching. Generally, I'd say that main exercise, doing it for 3-4 months at a time is fine. And because the load is going to change, and that's a change in stimulus, you won't run into too much adaptive resistance there. That secondary exercise, the leg press, hack squat kind of stuff, you could run that for maybe 2 months at a time, and it'd be fine. And then those smaller exercises, you could change those every month. But you definitely don't want to be changing them every week. Your body's not going to adapt that fast. Novel stimulus to the body doesn't have to be a different bar, a completely different exercise, because more weight is a new stimulus. Very subtle changes, foot position, hand position on the bench are new stimulus, and are going to help you avoid adaptive resistance. This kind of fear mongering of well, you're going to adapt if you don't change exercise every week. If I was in the equipment business, if I sold monolifts and reverse hypers and bands and chains and specialty bars for a living, you're damn right I would tell you need to do a new exercise every single week, and you need 20 different specialty bars to do it. But I'm not in the business of selling equipment. Notice the people that do tell you to do those exercises are in the business of selling equipment. But since I'm not in that business, I tell you that if my feet are right here versus right here, versus I go down slower, I stop at the bottom, I stop halfway up, I put the bar in front, I put the bar up on my back, I put the bar down on my back. That's a bunch of exercise variations. That can get you through years, if not decades, of training. And it all happened with one bar and the regular weights that go on the end of it. So I saved you guys like $20,000 on equipment. Yeah, I'll put a tip jar over here for that. But yeah, the changes can be fairly subtle. But yeah, I think 4 months on the main exercise, 2 months on the secondary, monthly on the small ones. And you could keep the small one for 4 months as well. But if it keeps you more interested in what you're doing to change it, then go ahead and change it then. Yep.
Is there different accessories you would say going to strengthen that particular stance? The second question is, in regards to bench press, what are the better accessories to help with the body?
All right, so the questions were about making a stance change in the squat, widening your stance out, if there's different exercises to address that. I'll talk about just making technical changes in general. And the second question, Max will talk about exercises for strengthening the lockout in the bench press. So for that first one, we're actually doing that exact thing right now with Marissa. She's trying to widen her stance out. Everyone watches the videos, oh my God, her stance is so narrow. I think if you don't see her in person, yes, her stance is on the narrow side of things, but she's so small that it's not as narrow as it seems. She wears size 2.5 shoes, so she's basically a child. So while her stance is 5 feet, while her stance is narrow, it's not as narrow as it seems. We're going to make that change last year after Worlds, but the sciatica problems just didn't allow for that quality of squat training, so we couldn't make the change then, and then you just get into meet after meet after meet. So we're working on that change now. The exercises we're doing to work on that are, one, just squatting with a wider stance, a gradually changing wider stance. If you want to change bar position, you want to make any technical change, grip width, even a drastic thing like conventional to sumo, it's not going to be in your best interest to be like, all right, today I'm a conventional deadlifter, next week I'm putting my feet out, so I have to worry about the plates smashing them. But you want to go modified, kind of close stance sumo, a little wider as you feel comfortable. High bar squatter, a little lower as you feel comfortable. Widen the stance out gradually. Something that's very effective for technical learning in the squat is controlling tempo and pauses. Because the more time you spend in a given position, the better you know it, the more comfortable you're going to be in it, the stronger you're going to be in it. So right now she's doing 4 count eccentric, 1 count pause squats just each week, trying to half an inch to an inch wider on the stance. And she's not going to end up out here. She's going to go from about here to here by the end of it. So it's a gradual change. So she's doing that with the regular squat, with her competition style squat, low bar squat. She's flexible, so her arms never bother her in that. And we want to change the competition technique, so we want to practice with that, even though typically we'd mostly be doing high bar at a time like this right after a meet. So slow eccentric, pause. She's doing that regular squat. She's doing that with goblet squats. She's doing lighter weights, kind of 60 to 80, 65 to 85% weights. Is really going to be the sweet spot of all training, but particularly making technical changes. If it's too light, it's just not going to carry over. You can't feel it right. If it's too heavy, you can't think about it. So that 60 to 80, 65 to 85% is the sweet spot there. She's doing leg press stuff, manipulating her foot position on there. And then because she's widening her stance out, I have her doing a couple sets of each the adductor and abductor machines every week. So really adductor strength, groin strength, and her stance isn't going to be so wide where that really comes into play, like her feet are all the way out at the edge of the rack. But yeah, adductor, abductor, groin, controlled tempo, pauses. That's going to be your ticket there.
As far as developing a better lockout in the bench press, my opinion, it kind of falls into 2 things you have to make sure you do. One is that you have to have complete development of all the upper body musculature. So it's easy for people to spend too little time devoting training to developing all the muscles in the upper body, your triceps, shoulders, pecs, using variations of exercises to augment that. And then the second is playing to the strengths and what's necessary in a raw bench. So raw bench, the faster you come off your chest, the higher your sticking point's going to be. So you have to develop tremendous power from your pecs, shoulders, obviously triceps, but primarily from the pecs, and a lot of it from off the chest. So in traditional, like doing your normal bench pressing, pausing for longer, pausing more often or on more reps. If you don't pause your reps in training, that kind of thing is a simple way to sort of augment that training.
Just pause the first rep of every set.
Right,
is like
always.
a real simple rule of thumb. First rep of every set. By the time you get through a whole training cycle, you'll have paused enough.
Right. Then in addition to that, the other exercises, I'm not a huge fan of doing things like 3-board or 2-board or board presses. Definitely not a huge fan of like doing a lot of slingshot bench pressing. And those are exercises that are kind of traditionally looked at as it's going to work my lockout, because raw benching is just so much a feat of coming off your chest with a lot of power. I really like something I've seen Chad do is Spoto presses, and Spoto presses are done where basically you bring the bar down to about an inch or 2 off your chest and hold, and then press from there. And that creates a lot of extra tightness, a lot more time under tension. It's a good exercise for developing that. I like to have people do at least 1 or 2 variations in addition to regular bench pressing. So if you bench with a really big arch, then doing some kind of flat back bench pressing, right? So picking your feet up, either putting them on the bench. You can do that, you can probably do that with Spoto presses where their feet are on the bench. So something like that where you're taking your feet up, you're taking the arch out, so you're increasing the range of motion a little bit. And then something like a close grip bench press or an incline press, or both, depending on what people benefit from. The best bench presser I ever coached she might still hold the all-time American record in the bench. I think she did 319 at 165. And she benched all of her bench presses with her feet literally like gently dangling on the floor, completely flat backed, and had tremendous power in her pecs and came off her chest really, really fast. So, that is a super, super important part of it.
That goes for any of the lifts too.
Right.
You get better at the start of the concentric, the more likely you are to carry through the rest of the way. So you're faster, more explosive out of the hole in the squat, better off the chest in the bench press, better off the floor in the deadlift. You're more likely to finish the lift.
Right. And as a total strategy, you got to look at what your weaknesses are, right? If it's purely a lockout problem, or it's that you haven't gained any new muscle mass in your upper body in 3 training cycles because you didn't do enough volume of bench pressing or accessory exercises to do that. And accessory meaning the big exercises, not the little gravel that we're filling the bucket with, but close grip bench presses, spoto presses, some incline press, to a lesser degree military press or a strict press. I think the higher the angle gets, the less transference there is to the actual bench press, but those are the big ones. Focus on those and make sure that you're both, one, gaining body weight, you're developing power off the chest, and you're doing the exercise in a way that allows you to maximize development of the pecs.
You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so my question was, get a lot of prior military coming in and collapsed arches, orthotics, fasciitis. So should they swap with the orthotics? Should they get some shoes or college shoes? How do they get the 3 points of contact? Because they're having trouble,
Yeah. So the question, you got screwed up feet, collapsed arches and flat feet, whatever, from whatever background it is. I wouldn't suggest squatting with no shoes on because it's just going to be too intense of loading. But in the warm-ups, that's where you're going to be able to address things, doing barefoot type of like toe, what's the toe, like dexterity kind of exercises where they're spreading their toes apart, clenching in, spreading apart. You could do that anytime you don't have your shoes on. Doing individual toe dorsiflexion, like just grabbing the big toe and pulling it up, the next toe pulling it up, going through like that. Maybe doing some goblet squat type of stuff early in the training in bare feet could be appropriate, and trying to reestablish the positioning then. But when they get to actually squatting, if the Olympic lifting shoe and the orthotic insert is what allows them to be in the best position they can then that's what they gotta wear then. So I'd try and fix it away from the main part of training with the corrective exercises, and then get the best that they can in the main stuff. So let's take one more question. I know it's a lot of pressure. You have to have a really good question. Well, there's a few options. Who feels like they have the best question? He's raising his hand the highest. He must have the best question. Yeah, so training with the sled as a general physical preparedness exercise is fine. It's really too general to even fall into powerlifting categories, in my opinion. If you want to, get in better shape for powerlifting, do more squat, benching, and deadlifting for more reps, for more sets with controlled rest periods. Once you get through a hypertrophy phase, and I've squatted 8 sets of 8 at above 500 pounds. Like, you'll be in plenty good enough shape for powerlifting to do that. If you want to, use recovery modalities like if you're using the sled, something as an active recovery tool, well, I think you'd be better served to just go in and do very light squatting and deadlifting, because then you're going to get the blood flow into the exact muscles that need recovering, but you're also going to be able to get some level of technical development as well. So finally, if you're using the sled because you like doing it, and it makes you breathe a little bit hard and feel better, more power to you. When you do that, sled, prowler, whatever it is, you do not want to get into a highly lactic state where your muscles are burning really bad, or you're throwing up or something like that, because that's making you weaker and less powerful for a strength sport. that could occasionally have a role in strongman where lactic tolerance is important. But I'd use the sled or the prowler in a tempo interval, and this is an idea from a track coach, Charlie Francis. So it might be maybe a 30-meter sled pull at 60 to 75% intensity. If you want to be really specific, you could time like your fastest one and take 60 to 75% of that, or you could just kind of go by feel. So it's not a jog, it's not a sprint, it's a quick run with it. Pull that 30 meters, you drop down, do 10 push-ups or 20 to 30 reps of abs, and then walk 30 meters and back, then go again. 20 reps, push-ups, abs, walk down and back, go again. So your heart rate is getting high enough that you're developing some aerobic capacity, but it's not so hard that you're going to go real lactic with it. And then real simple progression. Maybe the first week you do 2 sets of 6 like that, with 1 rep being the sled pull, push-ups, second rep next way, and then once you do 6, you rest 3 to 5 minutes and then go again. Next week 2 sets of 8. Next week 2 sets of 10. Once you're doing 2 sets of 10 of that, maybe the pace increases a little bit, but that's going to be more than enough to be in shape for powerlifting. If it's body composition type of stuff, that's going to deal a lot more with diet. I've done a lot of conditioning in my life. I was still fat the whole time I did it because I ate whatever I wanted. All right. So this was another episode of The Jug Life. We thank you very much to all the fine people here at Arlington Strength in Arlington, Texas, for being great guests for us today. If you like The Jug Life, go on iTunes, give us a 5-star review, write us something funny or nice. Helps more people find the podcast, and we always appreciate reading them. Upcoming events, we will be on Long Island on August 19th for the Juggernaut Performance Summit. Max talking about technique, myself programming, Dr. Mike on nutrition, Dr. Quinn on mobility, and Dr. James Hoffman on recovery. You can earn yourself some CEUs from the NSCA. Even you fine Texas people can do that. We've come to Texas for this before, but last year in New York we had people from 22 different states, even from Vancouver, Canada, Nevada, all the way out to New York. It's a big airport. It's easy to fly into. So check that out if you want to. We'll be recording part of it, but not releasing the full version as recorded, at least not for like a year or something after. Otherwise, online coaching. We do online coaching for powerlifting, weightlifting, super total, strongman, and power building. And you can find out about all of our different programs at juggernautcoaching.com. Subscribe to our YouTube, where we release 3+ videos per week, all thanks to the world's strongest videographer, Shorty Sedang, 500-pound deadlifter, this man right here. Yeah, Shorty. And by far the hardest working Juggernaut employee. And yeah, that's about it. Max, where can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram, Max_Ada, on Facebook, or you can email me, max@jtsstrength.com.
And I'm Chad Wesley Smith, at Chad Wesley Smith, and at Juggernaut Training on Facebook and Instagram. This was The Jug Life, and we'll see you next week. Hey, thank you.